As a Canadian artist living on the West Coast, I create shapes on canvas which emerge both from my imagination and from the profusion of forms in the coastal rainforest. When I was a child, my backyard was the Capilano Canyon on Vancouver's North Shore. The shapes made by the trees and undergrowth in the forest created a world where my fantasies could run amok. Most of my adventures ended up here down by these natural pools made by the Capilano River. This area became a second world for me where I could escape into the primal forces of nature. It's a creative place and led me to want to create something myself. I love the raw, organic energy of this landscape. I moved with my family to West Vancouver when I was 6. The house I grew up in was an architectural show home designed in the modernist style by my father, Doug Simpson. At the time, he was a pioneer of the West Coast style of architecture. My father had a mural painted by local artist John Corner, and it ran right down the side of the family room and out onto the terraces. It was very geometric and contained all kinds of shapes that I would study by the hour. Looking at this mural constantly gave me an awful lot of ideas visually and produced an interesting contrast with the rainforest setting. And, it was an interesting duality was formed really by this precise geometric mural contained within extreme shapes of trees and roots and ferns. So it was an interesting paradigm that was created there with those two elements. The contrast between the cool modernist lines of the house and the tangled web of the forest generated a tension that I needed to find a way to express. When I was a teenager, I remember discovering the work of Max Ernst in my school library. His approach to nature conditioned mine and made me want to be the kind of artist who penetrated the fantastic world of forms suggested by the forest, but not limited by it. I used to sense magic was in this natural setting here, and I still do. As an artist, it's something I can always draw on, whether it was the trees or these natural pools here by the side of the river, the sheer cliffs that come down with the trees that grow out of them. It's an almost impossibly beautiful spot. It's my West Coast, it's sort of where I grew up, and I think it probably had a big influence on my work as an artist.
Today, painters like myself who are doing landscape painting and people like Gregg Simpson who are doing abstract work which really comes out of landscape. In the end, we are all regional painters because we have to come out of our own experience.
As an abstract painter in BC, I find that the best you can do with landscape is often to represent a detail of it or a sort of an inner force to it, the dynamism of nature. In a lot of the art in British Columbia, there's a strong tradition connecting spirit and landscape. Native art contains organic shapes like ovoids with strong outlines and colors, particularly red and black. In the mid-1980s, I was obsessed with the ovoid shape. It began to look almost embryonic.
I usually start a painting by flooding the canvas with water, and then laying down strokes in a manner almost like calligraphy.
I gradually build the strokes into forms, and then by adding more color and more outlines, I transform those shapes into a mosaic of color.
When it works, it becomes something that has a resonance for me. The painting tells me what to do next.
The first works that I was known for, I believe, was in the late 1960s, early 70s, the collages, and used history books and old engravings and industrial shots. In the same period, I was doing a lot of hard-edge kind of pop-influence painting.
Gregg Simpson. I'm more aware of the paintings he has done later on, the Magritte-like, I think the period where he was most influenced by Magritte, and which in fact, it's another also definition of surrealism. Breton was saying, if you look very closely in everyday life, there is always something very strange. And this is what Magritte was painting, but I think this is also what at a certain period Gregg Simpson was painting. The strangeness of objects that you observe, but suddenly they appear to you very, very unusual. And also what you encounter by chance, what you don't expect.
It's true that Gregg Simpson was highly influenced by Max Ernst at a certain period of his life, and he used all his techniques such as frottage, grattage, fumage.
Frottage, yeah, that's like a sort of a kid's game that they draw on a paper that's with a penny underneath, and it brings the impression of the penny through. So I used that as a tool to liberate myself from starting with a preconceived idea. It's very much not preconceived. The technique of grattage is where you put a colored ground down first, different colors. You put on black paint on top of that, usually covering the whole surface. And then you scrape it off using various implements, and it leaves traces of the color underneath. Fumage is another technique where you use a paraffin candle and you hold it underneath a white card or something that won't catch fire, and the smoke will trace patterns on it, again, extremely spontaneously. You can't really control it. The only difference I brought to it was that, like frottage, I used a grid, and I filtered the smoke through it, and it made patterns. Decalcomania was a technique I used in the early 70s, and trying to get something more spontaneous going.
Decalcomania is a very difficult technique, putting gouache on a piece of paper and applying another piece of paper over it and pressing with the hand and drawing sort of blindfolded, because you do not know what the result will be, and then lifting the paper and seeing the result. The classical decalcomania is in black and white. Gregg went to color.
Once I switched from the black and white, though, it took on a different feeling. Again, more lyrical. I was using colored gouaches, a sort of watercolor paint, and created some more interesting images. You're still getting the effect of decalcomania, which is a sort of subterranean caverns and strange flora and fauna.
During the early 1970s, I took my surrealist-inspired works to Paris, where they attracted the attention of French art critic and historian José Pierre, a member of the post-war surrealist group with André Breton, its founder.
José Pierre did emphasize the West Coast very much.
And he wrote his book entitled Une Nouvelle Arcadie. It was published, I believe, in 1983. And he reproduced a painting by Gregg Simpson.
I don't think it is only José Pierre that recognized Gregg Simpson as an international artist, but also Saran Alexandrian.
Eventually I met Saran Alexandrian, who was one of the historians with Breton in the late 40s, the post-war surrealist group in Paris, and published my work in Superior Inconnu, which was a great honor because he'd started it the year I was born, 1947. In the late 1970s and early 80s, I started moving from this sort of drawn-out, planned-out paintings and these sort of dreamscape interiors into an automaticist abstraction.
find the physical process of mark making and painting and building of forms leads one into a subject. By building forms and then subtracting forms and redelineating shapes, one achieves a balance that can only be arrived at through a long process of building and shaping. And it's not done in one go, let's put it that way. I've had parallel careers in music and art, but never one at the expense of the other. However, there are certain similarities in improvising music and improvising a piece of art. So the two mediums have, to me, always gone together.
Music is nearly absent in the European movement under André Breton. However, in Vancouver and the West Coast, at the inception of this effervescence, music was of great importance. And Gregg is not only a visual artist, he is also a talented percussionist.
There's so much rhythm in his paintings. It's so musical in its intent. In fact, one day when this friend of mine and her son were over, we were having dinner in the kitchen, and her son disappeared. Her son Adam is 23, and he was standing in front of this painting. He said, "I've been here 5 minutes looking at this painting. You know, it's so musical. It must have been painted by a musician."
Gregg's painting became more abstract. Undoubtedly, a great sense of design, a great sense of composition, a great sense of rhythm, and we intimately linked to music.
When I was just out of high school, I was 18, I rented a place in Kitsilano, an old storefront, and used it as a painting studio, drawing from the model there actually. And then we started rehearsing with the Al Neil Trio. It went on for a number of years, but we rehearsed there and then started putting on weekend performances that were just charged people a donation. We started getting involved with other filmmakers and dancers and poets.
We all know about the history of artist-run centers, and Gregg was a part of the Sound Gallery, which was a multimedia space that they set up, kind of this psychedelic space they set up in the mid-60s. And Gregg had a huge role in that. He was one of the first creative people involved in the Sound Gallery, which really was the genesis of all the multimedia stuff going on in the city today.
Eventually we outgrew the space of the Sound Gallery and moved downtown to a bigger space we called Motion Studio. We had poets again, dancers, the Helen Goodwin dancers, and in 1967 Intermedia came along, a multimedia collective of artists working with no fixed program at all, and it was very free.
Intermedia gave birth to a lot of different movements, but two major ones kind of grew out of it. The main one was photoconceptualism. Definitely they would trace their history back to Intermedia because they were experimenting with slides and photography, which at that time was new. And then the other direction that it went and that it gave birth to that is less well known is the surrealism and the painters like Gregg Simpson. But I think they get a lot less recognition, so even though they gave birth to this movement, they're now sort of seen as very separate from the photoconceptualists when ironically they both grew out of the late 60s, early 70s.
During the 10 years that followed the intermediate period, my work went through an evolution from the hard-edge pop influences of the 60s to a type of neo-surrealism. Then I began a shift by way of some free-form drawings to a kind of organic abstraction. I would pour paint directly onto the canvas and let it flow in different patterns, kind of letting gravity do the work initially, and then follow it up with a lot of meticulous overpainting to bring out certain shapes and areas. In 1994, I returned to Europe after a break of about 20 years and traveled extensively through Italy and France. In Brittany, the stone alignments seem to have a relationship to the configurations on the beaches, so I studied the forms and translated them into paintings, and I later did the same on the Fontainebleau Forest, which is a venerable subject of 19th century French landscape painting. The first day